I still remember the smell of fresh cedar shavings falling onto the concrete floor of my workshop. It was a sharp, clean scent, the kind that clears your sinuses and makes you want to take a deep breath. That was 30 years ago. Today, sitting in the guest room, or as my son-in-law Brad calls it, the storage unit, the only smell is the stale, recycled air of the HVAC system. It hums constantly, a low, artificial drone that never lets you experience true silence. I sat there holding my morning coffee in the old chipped mug Sarah gave me for Father's Day back in '98. The steam rose up, disappearing into the cold, gray light of the room. I found myself staring at the wall, looking past the paint. I knew exactly where the studs were behind that drywall. I knew because I hung them myself. I drove every nail. I sanded every joint until it was smooth as glass. The silence didn't last. The door flew open without a knock. There was no "Good morning, Frank," no acknowledgement that a human being was sitting in the chair. It was Brad. He was wearing those wireless earbuds he never seems to take out, pacing around the small room like a caged tiger. He was shouting into the air, his voice filling the space I had built. I heard him say, "No, I told you, liquidate the dead assets. If it's not generating ROI, it's dead weight. Cut it loose." He stopped right in front of me to check his reflection in the window glass. He adjusted his expensive hair, fixed his collar, and didn't look at me once. To him, I was just part of the furniture. I was just an old armchair that took up too much valuable square footage. I took a sip of my coffee. It had gone cold. Brad turned around, still talking to the invisible people in his ears. He swept his hand around the room, pointing at my life, my books on the shelf, the picture of my late wife Martha, the model ship I was building for my grandson. "Yeah, I'm looking at the space right now," he said loudly. "We clear this junk out, put in the green screen, maybe a dedicated server rack. It's scalable." Junk. He called it junk. He walked out as quickly as he entered, leaving the door wide open. The cold draft from the hallway hit my legs, but I didn't get up to close it. I just sat there, listening to his voice fade down the hallway, repeating that phrase over and over, "Dead assets." I looked down at my hands. They were wrinkled, scarred, and tired, but they were the hands that built the roof over his head. And in that moment, the realization hit me harder than a hammer. He wasn't talking about stocks or crypto. To him, I was the dead asset, and he was getting ready to liquidate me.
I wasn't always the quiet old man shrinking into the corner of a guest room. There was a time when my boots hit the ground with purpose, heavy with mud and wet concrete. I served 2 tours overseas, in places where the heat was so thick you felt like you were breathing through a wool blanket. When I came back, I didn't ask for handouts. I started my construction business with nothing but a rusty pickup truck and a loan I was terrified to take out. For 30 years, I woke up at 4 a.m., long before the sun, my body aching in a way that young men like Brad will never understand. I poured foundations in the freezing rain and framed roofs under the blistering July sun, all so my daughter, Sarah, would never have to know what it felt like to have calluses on her hands. I paid for Sarah's college tuition in checks that I wrote with hands still covered in drywall dust. I wanted her to have the world. And when she brought Brad home, a man who wears suits that cost more than my first work truck and talks about synergy and leverage, I tried to be happy for her. I really did. I thought she had found someone who would protect her the way I did. When they got married, I gave them the down payment for this house. Actually, let's be honest with history. I gave them the house. The down payment was nearly 80% of the value. I signed the papers, handed them the keys, and thought I was buying my daughter's security. I thought I was buying peace of mind. But lately I've realized that to Brad, I wasn't a father or a benefactor. I was just a silent ATM, a machine that dispensed cash and stability without requiring a PIN code or a thank you. Just last week, I was in the kitchen, trying to fix the garbage disposal unit that had jammed. I was under the sink, on my back with a flashlight in my mouth, tightening a bolt. Brad walked in, stepping over my legs as if I were a pile of laundry. He was on the phone again, ordering some exotic sushi delivery for lunch. He looked down at me, not with appreciation, but with a look of mild annoyance. "Frank," he said, covering his microphone, "just call a plumber. Why do you always have to struggle with things? It's such a scarcity mindset." Scarcity mindset. That's his favorite phrase. He uses it whenever I fix a toaster instead of buying a new one, or when I save leftovers instead of throwing them in the trash. He stood there lecturing me about abundance while wearing a watch I knew he bought on credit, living in a house I paid for, waiting for food he couldn't cook. I crawled out from under the sink and wiped the grease from my hands onto my work pants. "It's not scarcity, Brad," I said quietly. "It's capability. There's a difference between being able to pay someone and being able to do it yourself."
He just rolled his eyes, a smirk playing on his lips that said he knew better. That's exactly what holds people back, Frank. You trade your time for money. I leverage other people's time to create wealth. That's the modern way. The irony was so thick it almost choked me. He talks about creating wealth, but I see the Amazon packages piling up at the door every single day. Useless gadgets, designer clothes, things that lose their value the moment the cardboard is opened. I see the late-night lights in his office as he frantically moves money between accounts. I recognize the look of a man who is juggling chainsaws. I lived through recessions. I know the smell of desperation, even when it's covered in expensive cologne. He thinks my silence is submission. He thinks my frugality is fear. He doesn't realize that the scarcity mindset he mocks is the only reason he has a roof to sleep under tonight. He calls me a dead asset, but he has forgotten the most basic rule of construction. You never, ever insult the man who poured the foundation, because that man knows exactly where the cracks are, and more importantly, he knows how to bring the whole thing down. It was the 4th of July. For as long as I can remember, that date has meant something specific to me. It's not just about hot dogs or fireworks, it's a ritual. Every year at 8 a.m. sharp, I go out to the front porch and hang my flag. It's not a new flag bought from a supermarket bin. It's heavy, made of thick cotton, with stitching that has held together through decades of wind and rain. The red is a little faded, softening into a dusty brick color, and the white stripes have that slight yellow tint of age. But to me, that wear and tear is what makes it beautiful. It shows that it has survived, just like I have. I had just secured the bracket and stepped back to salute, a habit I never broke after the service, when the sliding glass door opened behind me. It was Brad. He wasn't alone. He had a few of his friends over for an early brunch. They were all dressed in matching shades of beige and white, holding slim glasses of mimosa, looking like they had walked out of a catalog for people who have never worked a day in their lives. The chatter stopped as they saw me, or rather, as they saw the flag. Brad walked onto the porch, a tight, embarrassed smile plastered on his face. He put a hand on my shoulder, not in affection, but to steer me away. "Frank," he said, his voice loud enough for his friends to hear, but pitched to sound like he was scolding a child. "We talked about this. The aesthetic for the party is global modern. The flag is just, it's a lot. It's a bit aggressive, don't you think?" I froze. I felt the blood rushing to my ears. "Aggressive?" I repeated, my voice low. "Brad, this is Independence Day. This flag is why you get to stand here drinking champagne on a Tuesday morning." One of his friends, a guy with expensive glasses and soft hands, chuckled. "Oh, come on, Frank," he chimed in. "Nationalism is a bit of a disease, isn't it? We're trying to move past those old tribal symbols. It clashes with the vibe Brad is trying to curate here." Curate. They were curating a life while I was remembering the men who didn't come back. I looked past Brad, searching for Sarah. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, holding a tray of appetizers. Our eyes met through the glass. I waited for her to say something. I waited for her to tell her husband that her father earned the right to fly that flag. I waited for her to defend the history of her own family. But she didn't. She just looked down at her wine glass, biting her lip, and turned away. That silence hurt more than Brad's words. It hurt more than shrapnel. It was the sound of my own legacy turning its back on me. Brad sighed, checking his watch. "Look, Frank, just take it down for today, okay? Let's not make a scene. We have important guests coming." My hands were shaking, not from age and not from weakness. They were shaking with a rage so cold and precise it frightened me. I wanted to tear the poor trailing off. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I fell back on my training, discipline. I turned back to the flag. I didn't just yank it down, I unhooked it carefully. I treated it with the reverence it deserved, even as they watched me with pity. I folded it strictly following military protocol, corner to corner, triangle by triangle, tucking the stars in until only the blue field was visible. I held it against my chest like a shield. "Enjoy your party, Brad," I said. My voice was dead calm. I wouldn't want reality to ruin your aesthetic. I walked past them, clutching my folded flag, feeling like a stranger in the very house I had built. They went back to their laughter before I even closed the door. They thought they had won. They thought the old man had obeyed. They didn't see the fire they had just lit. They didn't know that by forcing me to take down the flag, they had just declared war. It was a Tuesday morning, quiet and gray. The house felt empty, even though Brad was sitting across from me at the kitchen island. Sarah had already left for work, rushing out with a quick peck on my cheek and avoiding my eyes. She knew. I realized later that she must have known what was coming. Brad was drinking a green smoothie that looked like swamp water. He placed a glossy brochure on the marble counter and slid it across to me with 2 fingers, like a blackjack dealer sliding a card. I looked down at it. Sunny Meadows Senior Living. The cover showed a smiling elderly couple playing chess in a sunlit garden. It looked peaceful. It looked expensive. It looked like a waiting room for death. "Frank," Brad started, his voice terrifyingly casual. "We need to talk about the roadmap for Q3. He spoke about our living situation as if it were a quarterly business review. He talked about friction points and optimizing square footage. I sat there, clutching my coffee mug, listening to him dismantle my life with buzzwords. "Here's the reality," he said, leaning forward, the smell of kale and mint on his breath. "You're slowing us down. Sarah and I are pivoting. We're launching a new lifestyle brand, and we need space. We need a dedicated content creation studio with proper lighting and soundproofing. And honestly, having you in the guest room, it just kills the vibe. It's hard to project success and youthful energy when there's a..." He paused, searching for a polite word. "When there's a generational gap sitting in the background." I didn't blink. "You want my room for a camera?" I asked. "It's not just a camera, Frank. It's a studio. It's an asset. Right now, your room is a liability. It's dead space." He topped the brochure. "Sunny Meadows is great, high-end. We've already looked into the deposit. It's within budget, mostly." Then came the hammer. "We need you out by the 1st of the month," he said. "That gives you 30 days. I think that's generous." He didn't ask. He didn't suggest. He commanded. There was no emotion in his eyes, no flicker of guilt for kicking out the man who paid for the very roof he was sitting under. There was only calculation. He looked at me and saw an obstacle to his vanity project. He saw an old dog that needed to be put down so he could buy a purebred. 30 days, I repeated slowly. "Look, don't make this difficult," Brad said, standing up and checking his phone. "It's better for everyone. You get care, we get our life back. It's a win-win." He walked out of the kitchen, leaving the brochure on the counter between us. I stared at the smiling couple on the cover. They looked happy, but as I looked closer, I saw what they really were: forgotten. My heart started to hammer against my ribs, but it wasn't panic, it was clarity. For years, I had made excuses for him. I told myself he was just young, just ambitious, just different. But in that moment, staring at that glossy eviction notice, the fog lifted. He wasn't just ambitious, he was a predator, and he had just made the fatal mistake of cornering a man who had nothing left to lose. I left the brochure on the counter and walked straight out the side door into the garage. The moment the heavy door clicked shut behind me, the air changed. It didn't smell like kale smoothies or expensive candles out here. It smelled of motor oil, cold concrete, and old rubber. It smelled like work. This was the only place left on the property that Brad hadn't touched. He called it dirty and analog. To me, it was a cathedral. Under a dusky canvas tarp in the center of the room sat my 1969 Mustang. I hadn't turned the engine over in 2 years, not since my arthritis got bad, but I never let the battery die. I walked past the tool bench, running my hand over the vice grip I've had since the 80s. Cold steel, reliable.
I wasn't here to work on the car though. I was here to dig up a ghost. I made my way to the back corner behind a towering stock of winter tires that hadn't been moved in a decade. My back protested as I shoved the heavy rubber wheels aside, gritting my teeth against the pain. I wasn't going to let a little pain stop me, not today. Behind the tires, flush with the concrete floor, was a small, unassuming metal safe. As I knelt down on the cold floor, a memory washed over me, clear as day. It was 30 years ago. I was sitting in a wood-paneled office across from Old Man Miller, my attorney. He was smoking a cigar, you could do that inside back then, and looking over the purchase papers for this land. "Frank," he had said, pointing a yellowed finger at me, "you're a generous man. You're building this house for your family. But listen to me. Put the house in the family trust, sure, but keep the land deeds separate. Keep the ground lease in your name only. You never know what the future holds, or who might try to take what's yours." At the time, I thought he was just being a paranoid old lawyer. I did it just to shut him up. I signed the papers, locked them away, and forgot about them. For 30 years, they had sat in this dark corner, gathering dust while I played the role of the quiet, helpful father. My hands were trembling as I reached for the dial. It wasn't fear this time, it was adrenaline. Left to 24, right to 10, left to 05. Click. The sound was loud in the silent garage. It sounded like a gunshot. I pulled the heavy steel door open. The smell of old paper drifted up. There they were, the original deed, the land survey, and the ground lease agreement, dated 1995. I stared into the dark metal box. Brad thought he was playing a game of chess against a senile old man. He didn't realize that while he was busy capturing pawns, I had been hiding the king in a hole in the floor for 3 decades. I reached in to grab the folder, my heart pounding against my ribs like a hammer. But as my hand closed around the papers, my fingers brushed against something else, something that definitely didn't belong in my old safe. My hand closed around a thick, crumpled envelope shoved way in the back of the safe, wedged behind the deed box. It didn't belong there. It looked like it had been hidden in a panic. I pulled it out into the dim light of the garage. It was addressed to Brad. The red stamp on the front screamed one word: urgent. I hesitated for a moment. I was raised to believe that reading another man's mail is a sin, but kicking a man out of his own home is a bigger sin. I tore it open. It was a letter from a private lending firm, one of those predatory companies that give quick cash at loan shark rates. I put on my reading glasses, my eyes scanning the dense legal text. Phrases like notice of default, immediate liquidation, and collateral seizure jumped out at me. Then I saw the numbers. My breath caught in my throat. Brad hadn't just taken out a small loan, he had taken out a massive second mortgage on the house, my house, using a power of attorney Sarah must have signed without reading. And where did the money go? Attached to the notice was a statement from a cryptocurrency exchange. It was a bloodbath. He had bet the farm on some digital coin with a dog on it, and the market had crashed. He was down 90%. I lowered the paper, my hands shaking with a new kind of anger. It wasn't just rage anymore. It was disgust. Everything made sense now. The roadmap for Q3, the lifestyle brand, the sudden need to turn my room into a content studio. It was all a lie, a desperate, pathetic lie. He didn't need a studio to grow. He needed my room so he could rent it out on Airbnb to pay the interest on his debts. Or worse, he needed me out so he could sell the house entirely without a stubborn old man getting in the way of the open house showings. He wasn't expanding. He was drowning. I looked around my garage. I thought about the sweat I poured into buying this land. I thought about Sarah, who probably thought her husband was a financial genius, unaware that he had gambled her security away on internet magic money. He looked at me this morning and saw a dead asset. But staring at these papers, I realized the truth. He was the one who was dead broke. He was trying to use me as a life raft, even if it meant drowning me to save himself. I carefully folded the letter and placed it right next to the ground lease agreement in my pocket. A cold calm settled over me. I wasn't just an evicted father-in-law anymore. I was the only thing standing between my family and total ruin. Brad wanted a business meeting? Fine. I was about to give him the most expensive lesson of his life. I didn't confront Brad immediately. That's the mistake young, impulsive men make. Instead, I put on my good jacket, walked past him while he was yelling at his phone in the living room, and drove my truck into town. I parked in front of a brick building that has stood on Main Street since the Eisenhower administration. The gold lettering on the window was peeling, simply reading Miller and Associates, attorneys at law. Walking into Miller's office was like stepping back into a time before the internet ruined everything. It smelled of old paper, leather binding, and pipe tobacco. There were no sleek white desks or ergonomic chairs here, just heavy walnut furniture and stacks of case files that reached halfway to the ceiling. Miller was sitting behind his desk. He's pushing 85 now, looking frail enough that a stiff breeze might knock him over. But the moment he looked up over his bifocals, I saw the eyes of a shark. He didn't offer me a latte or ask about my emotional bandwidth. He just pointed to the chair and poured 2 cups of black coffee from a thermos that looked as battered as I felt.
"Frank," he grunted, "you look like you're ready to kill someone or sue someone. I hope it's the second one, less paperwork." I didn't waste time with small talk. I laid everything out on his desk. The eviction brochure from Sunny Meadows, the bank letters showing Brad's debts, the original deed, and the 1995 ground lease agreement. Miller picked up the lease with a trembling hand. He adjusted his glasses, reading the text he had written himself 30 years ago. The room was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Slowly, a smile began to spread across his wrinkled face. It wasn't a nice smile, it was a predatory smile. It was the smile of a general who just realized the enemy has marched directly into a minefield. "Frank," he said, his voice raspy but clear, "do you remember why I wrote this clause in Section 4? I shook my head. He tapped the paper with a bony finger. "Severability of improvements. It's an old-school legal mechanism. In plain English, it means Brad owns the structure, the wood, the glass, the drywall, but you own the earth it sits on." He leaned back, intertwining his fingers. When a ground lease is terminated, say for violation of good conduct, or simply because the term is at will, the tenant is required to return the land to its original condition. I stared at him, the gears finally turning. Return it to its original condition? Exactly, Miller chuckled, a dry, dusty sound. That means he has to remove his property from your land. He doesn't have to leave the keys, Frank. He has to take the damn house with him. He reached for his typewriter, yes, an actual typewriter, and rolled in a fresh sheet of paper. "Frank," he said, his fingers hovering over the keys, "that's cute, but according to state property statutes regarding trespassing on private land after a lease is voided, we only have to give him 24 hours to move his improvements off your dirt." The sound of the typewriter keys striking the paper sounded like gunfire. Clack, clack, clack. We were drafting a notice, not an eviction notice, a demolition order.
"Let's see how his lifestyle brand handles this," Miller muttered as he typed. For the first time in months, I didn't feel old. I didn't feel useless. Sitting there in the dust and the smell of old tobacco, watching a master craftsman at work, I felt dangerous. Dinner that night was an exercise in torture, but for the first time, I wasn't the one suffering. We sat at the long mahogany table, another piece of furniture Brad had bought on credit, eating steaks that were cooked a little too rare for my taste. The air in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Sarah kept her eyes glued to her plate, pushing a piece of broccoli around with her fork like she was trying to solve a puzzle. She looked tired. There were dark circles under her eyes that no amount of expensive makeup could hide. I wanted to reach out and tell her it was going to be okay, but she had made her choice. She was standing by her husband, even if he was standing on quicksand. Brad, on the other hand, was jubilant. He was on his 3rd glass of wine, his face flushed with the intoxication of what he thought was a victory. He spent 20 minutes talking about a huge deal he was closing next week, some partnership with a fitness influencer that was going to 10x our visibility. I listened. I chewed my steak slowly, savoring the flavor. I nodded at the right times. I didn't interrupt. Brad mistook my silence for submission.
He leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine glass, and looked at me with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "So, Frank," he said, his voice dripping with false concern, "did you start packing yet? The movers I hired are coming Monday morning at 8 a.m. sharp. They're fast. They'll have your room cleared out by noon." Sarah flinched. She finally looked up. "Brad, please, not at the table." "What?" Brad laughed, throwing his hands up. "I'm just coordinating logistics, babe. We need the schedule to be tight. Time is money." He turned back to me. "I assume you have everything sorted with Sunny Meadows." I wiped my mouth with the napkin and placed it neatly on the table. Inside, the old Frank, the Frank who felt useless and discarded, would have felt a sting of humiliation. But that Frank was gone. He had died in the garage the moment the safe clicked open. I looked Brad dead in the eye. I didn't blink. I didn't frown. My face was a mask of stone. "I'll be ready, Brad," I said softly. Brad nodded, satisfied. "Good. That's what I like to hear. Cooperation." I took a sip of water and set the glass down. "The real question," I continued, my voice dropping an octave, "is will you be ready?" Brad paused, the wine glass halfway to his lips. He frowned, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "Me? Ready for what? I'm just supervising the crew." "For the move," I said simply. He laughed again, a nervous barking sound. "Frank, you're confused. I'm not moving anywhere. This is my house." I didn't answer. I just smiled, a small, polite smile that didn't explain anything. I picked up my fork and took another bite of steak. Brad looked at Sarah, then back at me. He opened his mouth to say something, to assert his dominance again, but the words got stuck in his throat. The atmosphere had shifted. He could feel it, even if he didn't understand it. The dead asset at the end of the table wasn't acting like a victim anymore. He finished his wine in one gulp and left the table early, muttering something about emails. He didn't know it yet, but he had just eaten his last meal as the master of the house. Monday morning arrived with the beep, beep, beep of a reversing moving truck. It was 07:55 a.m. Brad was already on the porch wearing his silk robe and holding a stopwatch, acting like the director of a movie. "Careful with that door frame," he shouted at the two burly movers who were hauling boxes into the hallway. "That's encorded mahogany." I walked out onto the porch with a single small duffel bag over my shoulder. I wasn't carrying boxes, I was carrying my papers. Brad saw me and checked his watch. "Right on time, Frank. Look at you, all packed up. I'm proud of you. The shuttle to Sunny Meadows will be here in an hour." He reached out to pat my shoulder, a gesture of condescending victory. I stepped back, letting his hand fall into empty air. "I'm not going to Sunny Meadows, Brad," I said. He sighed, his face twisting into a mask of impatience. "Frank, we are not doing this again. The room is leased. The movers are here. Don't make me call the cops." "You won't have to," I said, pointing down the driveway. "I already did." A sheriff's cruiser turned into the driveway, lights flashing silently in the morning mist. Behind it was a vintage Lincoln town car. Old Man Miller stepped out of the Lincoln, clutching a leather briefcase, looking like the Grim Reaper in a three-piece suit. Brad's face went pale. "What is this? Did you call the police because you don't want to leave? That's pathetic, Frank." The deputy walked up the steps, tipping his hat to me. "Morning, Mr. Henderson." "Deputy," I nodded. Brad stepped forward, trying to regain control. "Officer, I'm glad you're here. This man is refusing to vacate my property. I need him removed immediately." The deputy looked at Brad, then looked at the paperwork Miller had just handed him. He looked back at Brad with a confused expression. "Your property, sir? According to the county clerk and this deed, you don't own this property." "What are you talking about?" Brad laughed nervously. "I have the mortgage. I pay the taxes on the house." Miller stepped forward, his voice dry as dust. "You own the improvement, son. That is correct. You own the structure known as the house. But my client, Mr. Frank Henderson, owns the land underneath it. And he owns the driveway you're standing on. And the lawn your truck is parked on." Brad looked at Sarah, who had just come out the door, her hand over her mouth. "Sarah, what is he saying?" Miller continued, mercilessly. "Per the terms of the 1995 Ground Lease Agreement, Section 4, Clause B, Upon termination of the lease by the landowner, the tenant shall have 24 hours to remove all personal property and improvements from the land, returning the lot to its original condition. I stepped forward. For the first time in years, I stood at my full height. The chronic pain in my lower back seemed to vanish, replaced by a spine of steel. "You gave me notice to vacate the room, Brad," I said, my voice steady and low, echoing across the lawn so the movers could hear. I accepted it. "But now, I am giving you notice to vacate my land." Brad stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. You can't be serious. Move the house? That's impossible." "That sounds like a you problem," I said. "You have 24 hours to pick up this house and move it somewhere else. If it's not gone by tomorrow morning, under state law, it becomes abandoned property, and then it becomes mine." The silence that followed was absolute. The birds stopped singing, the movers stopped moving. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Brad looked at the sheriff, begging for help. The sheriff just crossed his arms and shook his head. "He's right, son," the deputy said. "Technically, you're trespassing." I looked at my watch, the cheap Timex Brad used to make fun of. "You have 23 hours and 59 minutes, Brad. I'd start making calls if I were you." Brad didn't handle the news like a man. He handled it like a toddler who had just been told playtime was over. "This is insane," he screamed, his face turning a blotchy, violent red. He spun around to face Miller. "You can't do this. This is extortion. I'll sue you. I'll sue all of you. Do you know who my lawyers are?" Old Man Miller didn't even blink. He just opened his briefcase and pulled out another document. "I assume you mean the public defenders provided by the state? Because according to your credit report, you haven't paid your previous legal counsel in 6 months. They dropped you last week." Brad froze. The air seemed to leave his lungs. The movers, who were still holding a box of my books, looked at each other, set the box down on the grass, and started walking back to their truck. They knew a job gone bad when they saw one. "Don't you walk away," Brad yelled at them, his voice cracking. "I'm paying you." "Card declined this morning, boss," the lead mover shouted back without turning around. "We were going to ask for cash on delivery, but looking at this," he gestured to the sheriff in the Lincoln, "we're good." Brad turned to Sarah. She was standing on the porch steps, looking like a ghost. This was his last refuge. He ran to her, grabbing her hands. "Sarah, listen to me. Your dad is having a breakdown. He's confused. We need to get him help. Tell them this is our house." I stepped forward then. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the crumpled envelope I had found in the safe, the final notice from the bank. "Show her, Brad," I said. "Tell her why you really needed me out of the house. Tell her why you needed to rent my room." Brad lunged for the letter, but the deputy stepped in between us, his hand resting casually on his belt. Brad skidded to a halt, panting, sweat dripping down his forehead. I handed the letter to Sarah. Her hands shook as she unfolded the paper. I watched her eyes scan the lines. I saw the confusion turn to shock, and then to horror. She read about the second mortgage. She read about the crypto losses. She read that the house she thought was safe, barely audible. "Brad, you told me the business was booming. You told me we were expanding." "I was fixing it," Brad pleaded, his hands flying in the air. "I just needed a little more time. I needed the rental income from Frank's room to bridge the gap until the market turned. It was a strategy, Sarah, a strategy." "It wasn't a strategy," I said. "It was a gamble, and you lost." Sarah looked up at him. The admiration I used to see in her eyes was gone. The love was gone. All that was left was the cold realization that she had been sleeping next to a stranger. She dropped the letter on the porch. It fluttered down like a dead leaf. "Get out," she said. Brad blinked. "What?" "Get out," she screamed, a sound that tore from her throat, raw and painful. "Get off my dad's land, now." Brad looked around. The movers were gone. The sheriff was watching him. Miller was smiling that shark-like smile, and his wife was looking at him with pure hatred. He was completely, utterly alone. He tried to salvage one last shred of dignity. He straightened his silk robe, sniffed loudly, and pointed a trembling finger at me. "You'll regret this, Frank. You're destroying your family's wealth. You're living in the past." "Maybe," I said, "but at least I have a roof over my head." He stormed past me.
grabbed his car keys from the bowl near the door, and ran to his leased BMW. He paled out of the driveway, kicking up gravel, driving fast and reckless, running away from the truth he couldn't face. We stood there in the silence he left behind. The engine noise faded into the distance. The birds started singing again.
Brad left tire marks on the asphalt, black scars that marred the entrance to the home. Sarah sat on the porch steps, staring at them for a long time. She wasn't crying anymore. She was just empty. It's a look I've seen on soldiers who realize the war is over, but they have nowhere to go back to. I sat down next to her. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't mention Brad's name. There is no dignity in kicking a person when they are already down, even if that person is your own daughter. I didn't know, Dad, she whispered, pulling her knees to her chest. I really didn't know. I thought he was smart. I thought I was safe. I put my arm around her shoulders. She leaned into me, heavy with exhaustion. Safety isn't something a man buys for you, Sarah, I said gently. Safety is something you build, and sometimes you build it on a shaky foundation. When that happens, you don't burn the house down. You jock it up and pour new concrete. The next morning, the work began. We didn't have time for wallowing. We had a foreclosure clock ticking. I took Sarah to see Old Man Miller again. Then we went to the bank, not as beggars, but as negotiators. The bank manager, a young guy in a cheap suit, tried to be tough. He talked about asset seizure and liquidation. Miller just laid the ground lease on the desk. Here is the situation, Miller explained. You have a lien on a house structure. My client owns the land. If you foreclose on the house, you can't sell it to anyone else because Mr. Henderson here won't grant a new ground lease. You'll be stuck with a wooden box you have to pay to demolish. The manager's face dropped. He realized the house was worthless without the land. So, I said, leaning forward, here is my offer. I will assume the outstanding principal of the original mortgage. The second mortgage, the crypto money, that's unsecured debt attached to Brad personally. You go chase him for that. I take the house back. You avoid a messy legal battle you can't win. It took 3 days of haggling, but they folded. I dipped into my retirement savings, money I had put away for a rainy day. Well, it was pouring rain now. I bought back my own house for pennies on the dollar, clearing the debt Brad had piled onto it. When we got back home that afternoon, the house felt different. It was quiet. The nervous energy was gone. I found Sarah in the kitchen. She was taking down the minimalist art Brad had hung up, abstract shapes that meant nothing. She was holding a hammer, looking at a nail hole in the drywall. I don't know how to patch this, she said, her voice trembling. I walked over to the drawer, pulled out a tub of spackle and a putty knife. I handed them to her. I'm not going to do it for you, I said, smiling, but I'll show you how. Watch the angle of the knife. Smooth strokes. Don't overwork it. She took the knife. Her hand was shaky at first, but she took a breath, focused, and spread the paste over the hole. Smooth. Clean. Good, I said. Now let it dry. We'll sand it tomorrow. She looked at me, and for the first time in months, a genuine smile touched her lips. Thanks, Dad. Don't thank me, I said, picking up my toolbox. We've got a whole house to fix. Let's get to work. 6 months have passed since the day the house moved, or rather, since the day it stayed put and the problem left. The guest room is no longer a storage unit for dead assets. It's no longer a content studio for a fake life. It's painted a soft blue now. There's a crib in the corner. Sarah found out she was pregnant just before everything fell apart. She calls him Little Frank. It's a heavy name for a small boy, but he'll grow into it. I spend most of my mornings in the workshop again. The stale, recycled air of the HVAC system is gone, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of fresh cedar shavings. I'm building a rocking horse. No power tools this time, just hand planes and chisels. It takes longer, but the wood appreciates the patience. Sarah is working again. She got a job at the local library. It doesn't pay as much as her old corporate tigs, and she drives my old truck instead of a luxury sedan. But when she comes home, she's smiling. She wears jeans and flannel now, and her hands have a few calluses from the gardening we do on weekends. She looks like herself again. We haven't heard from Brad. I heard through the grapevine that he's in Florida trying to sell timeshares. I didn't smile when I heard that. I didn't frown either.
He's just a ghost from a bad dream we all woke up from. This morning, it was the 4th of July again.
At 8 sharp, I walked out to the front porch. The sun was cutting through the trees, the same trees I planted 30 years ago. I unfolded my flag. The red is still a bit faded. The white is still a bit yellowed. Sarah came out with the baby in her arms. She didn't look away this time. She didn't apologize. She watched me hook the grommets onto the pole. The flag caught the morning breeze and snapped open, waving proudly against the blue sky. No one told me it was aggressive. No one told me it clashed with the aesthetic. I put my arm around my daughter and looked out over the lawn. It wasn't the biggest house on the block. It wasn't the most modern, but it was ours. It was paid for with sweat, protected by truth, and held together by love. "Happy 4th, Dad," Sarah said, leaning her head on my shoulder. "Happy 4th, sweetheart," I replied. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the smell of summer grass and freedom. Brad was right about one thing. You have to liquidate dead assets to grow. We did, and now finally, we are rich.